The folded note sat beneath the napkin, edge barely visible, and Vito Bourne didn't notice it at first because he was staring at the waitress's hands. Steady, soft, scarred along the knuckles like she'd fought her way through something quiet and brutal. The kind of war that didn't make headlines. She placed the plate down without a word, her pregnant belly brushing the edge of the table, and when their eyes met for half a second, something in his chest cracked open like a fault line he didn't know existed. He'd come here for silence, for greasy food that didn't taste like power or blood, for a corner booth in a taco joint where nobody knew his name, where the fluorescent lights buzzed too loud and the salsa was too sweet, where he could pretend for 20 minutes that he wasn't Don Vito Bourne, that his empire wasn't rotting from the inside, that his enemies weren't circling, that his legacy wasn't going to die with him, because after 3 marriages, 4 mistresses, and a decade of trying, he had everything except the one thing that mattered. A child, an heir, a reason to believe his life was more than a mountain of cash and corpses. But hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to the channel. I'm so grateful you're here with me today, wherever you are in this wild world. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love connecting with you all. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. Trust me, it's going to wreck you in the best way. Now let's get back to it. The waitress. Mia, her name tag said, though he suspected that wasn't real, turned to leave, and that's when Vito saw it. The note, folded twice, tucked under the napkin like a secret handshake, like a message from a ghost. His pulse kicked. In his world, notes meant betrayal, meant wiretaps, meant someone knew too much, meant a bullet was already in the chamber. He scanned the restaurant. 3 other customers, all half asleep over their food, the cook visible through the kitchen window, flipping tortillas with the bored rhythm of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. The front door closed, the street outside empty, except for his black sedan and the driver who never asked questions. No threat, no ambush. Just a note. Vito unfolded it slowly, his fingers thick, scarred, hands that had strangled men and signed death warrants, shaken just enough that he noticed. The handwriting was careful, feminine, slanted slightly to the right. The ink from a cheap pen that had bled through in places. He read it once, then again, then a third time because his brain refused to process the words, refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. It's yours, the child. I didn't know how to tell you. The world went silent. Not the soft silence he'd come here for, but the kind that presses in like water, like drowning, like the moment before a bomb goes off. His heart hammered against his ribs, a prisoner trying to break free, and his vision tunneled until all he could see were those 8 words, black ink on white paper, a confession, a miracle, a lie. He didn't know which. Mine. The word barely left his throat, gravel and disbelief. And when he looked up, Mia was standing 3 feet away, hands folded over her swollen belly, tears balanced on her lower lashes like they were afraid to fall. And she nodded, just once, slow and certain. I'm not here to ask for anything, she whispered, voice steady despite the tears. Despite the way her hands trembled against her stomach. Despite the fact that she'd just detonated his entire existence. I just wanted you to know you finally have what you've been praying for. Vito Bourne, the man who'd built an empire on fear, who'd survived wars and betrayals and assassination attempts, who'd stared down senators and rival dons without flinching, stood up so fast his chair scraped the linoleum like a scream, and he didn't know if he wanted to run or collapse or grab her and demand answers or fall to his knees and thank a God he'd stopped believing in 20 years ago, when he managed. The word sharp, desperate. How? Mia glanced toward the kitchen, toward the front door, calculating her escape routes the way he'd taught people to do, the way someone did when they'd lived in his world long enough to know how it worked. 6 months ago, she said quietly. The night you came to the Belmont. You don't remember me. I was working the private bar upstairs. He searched her face, clawing through whiskey-soaked memories of that night. The Belmont Hotel, the deal with the Corsetti family, the bottle of scotch he'd killed alone after it all went south. The woman who'd poured his drinks and listened to him talk about legacy and loneliness like she actually cared. The woman whose face he couldn't quite remember, but whose voice, now that he heard it again, felt like coming home. You left before I woke up, he said. Not an accusation, just a fact. I looked for you. I know, Mia said, and one tear finally broke free, sliding down her cheek. I couldn't stay. You know why. Because his world devoured soft things. Because love was a liability. Because carrying his child made her a target, made the baby a weapon someone would use against him. You're coming with me, Vito said. And it wasn't a question, wasn't a command, just the only truth he had left. Both of you. Mia's eyes widened, fear and hope tangled together, and she opened her mouth to respond. But the bell above the door chimed, and 3 men walked in wearing suits too expensive for this neighborhood. And Vito's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his spine, because he recognized the tallest one, Luca, his cousin's enforcer, which meant his cousin knew he was here. Knew about the girl, maybe knew about the baby. And if that was true, then everything had just become infinitely more dangerous. Vito didn't reach for the gun because Luca's hands were visible, empty, and he was smiling that snake oil smile he used when delivering bad news wrapped in politeness. The kind of smile that made Vito want to put a bullet through it, just to see if anything genuine existed underneath. But instead he stepped sideways, positioning himself between Mia and the door, his body a shield before his brain even registered the decision. And that protective instinct, so foreign, so immediate, told him everything he needed to know about what this woman and the child inside her already meant to him. Dawn Bourne, Luca said, his voice carrying across the empty restaurant like he owned it. Like he hadn't just interrupted the most important moment of Vito's life. Your cousin's been looking for you. Says you missed the sit-down tonight. The sit-down. Vito had forgotten completely, which never happened, because in his world, forgetting meant disrespect, and disrespect meant blood. But tonight he needed to escape the suffocating weight of his own empire, the endless parade of men who wanted things from him, who measured their worth by their proximity to his power, who'd smiled while planning his funeral. Tell Polly I had business, Vito said, his voice flat, giving nothing away, the same tone he'd used 1,000 times to end conversations he didn't want to have. Luca's eyes drifted past him to Mia, lingering on her pregnant belly with a kind of calculating interest that made Vito's jaw clench. New business? Luca asked. And there was a question beneath the question, a test. Personal business, Vito corrected, ice in every syllable, which means it's none of yours. For a long moment, the only sound was the cook scraping the grill in the kitchen, oblivious or pretending to be. And Vito watched Luca's face for any sign that his cousin had sent him here for more than a message. For any indication that the note Mia had given him wasn't the only secret about to explode. But Luca just nodded slowly, that smile never quite reaching his eyes. Understood, Dawn Bourne. I'll let Polly know you're handling something important, but he'll want to see you tomorrow. Early? It was a leash disguised as a request, a reminder that even Vito Bourne answered to the family to the old codes, to the men who'd put him in power and could just as easily take it away, especially now that they smelled weakness. Now that Vito was 43 and childless, and the younger wolves were circling, whispering that maybe it was time for new blood, that maybe a man who couldn't even produce an heir didn't deserve to lead. "I'll be there," Vito said, but he was already calculating how to protect Mia, how to move her somewhere safe before Polly's paranoia turned her into a problem that needed solving. Because his cousin didn't believe in loose ends, didn't believe in trust, didn't believe in anything except power and the violence required to keep it. Luca and his men left, the bell chiming their exit like a church announcing sinners, and Vito waited until the black SUV pulled away before he turned back to Mia, who'd gone pale. Her hand pressed against her belly in a gesture so instinctively protective it made his chest ache. "You can't go back to wherever you've been staying," Vito said gently, trying to soften the command, trying to sound like something other than the man who barked orders and expected obedience. "They know about you now. That makes you a target," Mia finished, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I know how this works, Vito. I knew the risk when I wrote that note." The fact that she'd done it anyway, that she'd put herself in danger just to give him the truth, just to let him know he'd finally have what he'd been praying for, cracked something deeper in him. Some wall he'd built so high and thick, he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. "Why now?" he asked, needing to understand. "Why tell me tonight?" Mia looked down at her belly, her hand moving in slow circles, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Because I'm scared. Because I've been doing this alone for 6 months. And I'm strong, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to do it for 18 years. Because every time I feel her kick, I think about how she deserves to know her father, deserves better than me running from city to city, changing names, looking over my shoulder. Because you have a right to know. Her, a daughter, Vito's daughter." The words hit him like absolution, like every prayer he'd whispered in the dark had finally been answered, and he had to sit down before his legs gave out. Had to grip the edge of the table because the world was spinning, and his heart was too big for his chest, and he didn't know how to be this happy without it destroying him. "What's your real name?" he asked, because Mia wasn't it. He could tell by the way she hesitated before answering at the Belmont, the way she moved through the world like she was always one step ahead of her own shadow. "Amara," she said quietly. "Amara Strode. And before you ask, yes, I know who you are. I've always known." That should have scared him. The idea that she'd known exactly what she was getting into, that she'd planned this somehow, but instead it reassured him because it meant she wasn't naive, wasn't some innocent he'd have to protect from the truth, wasn't going to shatter the first time she saw what his world really looked like. "I had a sister," Vito said, the words coming out before he could stop them, before he could remember that he didn't talk about Elena, didn't let anyone see that wound. "She died when I was 16. Cancer. I watched her fade for 2 years. Watched my mother break. Watched my father drink himself to death trying to forget. And I promised myself, promised her, that I'd build something that lasted. Something that mattered. A family that couldn't be taken away." He looked up at Amara, needing her to understand. "I've spent 27 years keeping that promise. And I've failed. 3 wives who wanted my money, not my name. Mistresses who disappeared when things got complicated. Every doctor said the same thing. Low count, bad odds, probably never. And I stopped believing, stopped hoping." His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. "Until tonight." Amara moved closer, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from him, and reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers small and warm against his scarred knuckles. "I'm not asking you to marry me," she said softly. "I'm not asking for your empire or your money or your name. I just want our daughter to know her father. I want her to have what I never did. Someone who shows up, who stays, who loves her even when it's hard." And there it was, the thing Vito had been terrified to want, the thing he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. A chance to be more than the monster everyone feared, to be a father, to build something that mattered more than territory and respect and fear. "I have a place," he said carefully, thinking of the villa by the lake, the one property he'd never brought business to, the one place still clean. "It's quiet, safe. No one knows about it except my driver, Tony, and he'd die before he'd talk. You can stay there, both of you, until we figure this out." Amara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for lies or traps or ulterior motives. And Vito let her look, let her see everything he usually kept hidden, the loneliness, the desperation, the fragile hope that maybe this time, finally, he could have something real. "Okay," she whispered. "But Vito, if you're doing this just because you want an heir, if you're going to treat her like a business arrangement, I'd rather disappear right now." "No," Vito said fiercely, gripping her hand tighter. "I want this. I want you. I want to be there when she's born, when she takes her first steps, when she says her first word. I want every moment I've been robbed of. I want to be her father." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Vito born meant every word. Tony was waiting by the sedan, his eyes scanning the street with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd kept Vito alive through 3 assassination attempts. And when Vito emerged from the taco joint with Amara at his side, his driver's expression shifted from alert to confused to carefully neutral in the span of 2 seconds, asking no questions because that's what 20 years of loyalty looked like. But Vito caught the slight widening of Tony's eyes when they landed on Amara's pregnant belly, caught the moment his driver did the math, and arrived at a conclusion that made him stand straighter, protective. "We're going to the lake house," Vito said quietly, opening the back door for Amara, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching, uncertain of the boundaries, uncertain of everything except the fierce need to get her somewhere safe. "The back way. Make sure we're not followed." Tony nodded, already moving, already 3 steps ahead, and Vito slid into the back seat beside Amara, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light, floral, completely at odds with the sharp scent of fear coming off her in waves. And he wanted to tell her it would be okay, wanted to promise her safety and certainty and all the things he'd built his empire to provide. But before he could speak, his phone vibrated, Polly's name flashing across the screen like a warning. He considered ignoring it, considered throwing the phone out the window and disappearing into the night with Amara. Starting over somewhere his cousin's reach couldn't extend, but that was fantasy, and Vito dealt in reality, so he answered. "We need to talk," Polly said. No preamble, no warmth, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he already knew something Vito didn't want him to know. "About what?" Vito kept his tone neutral, his eyes on the street sliding past the window, watching for tails. "About the girl," Polly said, and Vito's blood went cold. "The pregnant one you're so interested in. Amara Strode, or should I say Amara Corleone." The name hit Vito like a fist to the throat, and he turned to stare at Amara, who'd gone absolutely rigid beside him, her face drained of color. And in that moment he knew she'd lied, knew there was more to the story, knew that whatever he'd thought was happening was infinitely more complicated. "I can explain. Amar whispered, her voice breaking. But Vito held up a hand, his attention still on Polly, on the ticking bomb of whatever revelation was coming. You've been slipping, cousin, Polly continued, almost gentle, the way a doctor might explain a terminal diagnosis, getting sentimental. So I did some digging on your waitress. Turns out she's Carmine Corleone's daughter. The Corleone family. Remember them? The family you destroyed 6 years ago? The family whose territories you absorbed, whose soldiers you scattered, whose boss you personally put 3 bullets into. Vito remembered. God help him. He remembered the blood, remembered Carmine begging, remembered pulling the trigger anyway because it was war, and mercy was a luxury neither of them could afford. Remembered hearing later that Carmine had a daughter somewhere. Estranged, missing, but he'd never found her, never thought about her again, because the dead had too many children, and he couldn't carry the weight of all of them. She was 17 when you killed my father, Amar said quietly beside him, not defensive, just factual. And when Vito looked at her, really looked, he could see it now. Carmine's dark eyes, his sharp cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw that had gotten the old man killed. I wasn't there. I'd left 2 years before, when I realized what kind of man he was, what kind of business he ran. I changed my name. Started over. I wanted nothing to do with that life. Then why come back? Vito's voice was harder than he intended, the betrayal already spreading through his chest like poison. Why find me? Why tell me about the baby? Because it's the truth. Amar's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed against her belly. I didn't know who you were that night at the Belmont. I swear to God, Vito, I didn't recognize you. It wasn't until after, until I looked you up, until I saw your face in the news and remembered my father's men talking about Don Bourne, about the war, about... She choked on the words. About how you killed him. And by then, I was already pregnant. And I didn't know what to do. And I've spent 6 months terrified and alone trying to figure out if I should tell you or just disappear. How touching, Polly said through the phone, reminding Vito he was still listening, still orchestrating whatever play this was. Here's what happens next, cousin. You bring the girl to me. Tonight. Because if she's telling the truth and that baby's yours, then congratulations. You've finally got your heir. But if she's lying, if this is some revenge plot from what's left of the Corleone family, then we handle it the way we handle all threats. Clean. Permanent. No, Vito said, the word absolute, and beside him Amara flinched. She's under my protection. You sure about that? Polly's voice dropped. Dangerous now. You willing to bet your life that she's not playing you? That she didn't get pregnant on purpose? That this whole thing isn't designed to get close to you, earn your trust, and put a bullet in your head when you're too busy playing house to see it coming? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and impossible to dismiss, because Vito had built his survival on paranoia, on trusting no one, on assuming the worst of everyone. And now Polly was asking him to do what had kept him alive for 27 years. Choose suspicion over hope. Choose survival over sentiment. Choose the empire over the girl. I need time, Vito said finally. 24 hours to verify her story. 12, Polly countered. And Vito, if you're wrong about her, if you let your desperation for a kid cloud your judgment, I'll do what needs to be done. For the family, you understand? Vito understood. Understood that his cousin was giving him a deadline to either prove Amar's innocence or deliver her for execution. Understood that the baby growing inside her, his daughter, maybe, possibly, if any of this was real, was already a target. Understood that the moment he'd read that note. His life had forked into two impossible paths, and he had 12 hours to choose which one would destroy him. He ended the call and turned to Amara, who was crying silently now, her shoulders shaking, and every instinct screamed at him to comfort her, to promise protection. But he'd stayed alive this long by listening to the quieter voice, the one that whispered about self-preservation and calculated risk. "Is it mine?" he asked, hating himself for needing to ask, hating the doubt in his own voice. "Yes," Amar said, meeting his eyes, unflinching despite the tears. "I swear, on my life, on her life, it's yours. That night at the Belmont was the only time I've been with anyone in over a year. I can take any test you want. I can—" The back window exploded inward, glass spraying across the seat, and Vito threw himself over Amara, shielding her body with his, as Tony swerved hard, tires screaming, and another shot punched through the door exactly where Vito's head had been 2 seconds earlier. "Get down!" Tony shouted, gunning the engine, and Vito caught a glimpse of the motorcycle pulling alongside them, the rider's face hidden behind a black helmet, the gun coming up for another shot. Vito pulled his own weapon, the weight familiar and grounding, and fired twice through the shattered window, hitting the motorcycle's front tire, sending the bike into a violent spin that ended with the rider tumbling across the asphalt in a shower of sparks. "You hit!" Vito demanded, running his hands over Amara, checking for blood, for wounds. And she shook her head, gasping, her arms wrapped around her belly. "The baby! The baby's fine. You're fine. I've got you," Vito said, pulling her against him. And he realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that it didn't matter if Polly gave him 12 hours or 12 minutes. It didn't matter what her last name was or who her father had been, or whether this was the smartest decision of his life or the stupidest. He'd already chosen the moment he'd covered her body with his, the moment he'd taken that bullet meant for him and made it about protecting her instead. "Change of plans, Tony," Vito said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "We're not going to the lake house. We're going to war." The safe house wasn't anything like Vito's usual properties. No marble floors, no armed guards at every entrance. Just a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, in a neighborhood where people minded their business and drug dealers outnumbered cops 3 to 1, which made it perfect because nobody would think to look for Don Bourne in a place that smelled like detergent and desperation. Tony had swept it twice, checking windows and exits while Vito got Amara settled on the worn couch, her hands still trembling from the attack, and he'd never felt more useless, more aware that all his power and money and connections meant nothing if he couldn't keep her safe, couldn't stop bullets from finding their way toward the mother of his child. "Who knew?" Amara asked quietly, her voice steadier now, her mind already working through the angles the way someone raised in this life would, even if she'd spent years trying to escape it. "About us. About tonight." Because that shooter wasn't random. Vito had been asking himself the same question, running through possibilities, and none of them were good. Luca saw us together at the restaurant. He could have made a call, or maybe someone's been watching you already, waiting to see if you'd lead them to something useful. He paused, hating the next words. "Or maybe you led them to me." Amara's head snapped up, hurt flashing across her face before hardening into something colder. "You really think I'd risk my baby's life for revenge? That I'd put her in the crossfire just to get back at you for my father?" "I don't know what to think," Vito admitted, the exhaustion and confusion and desperate hope all crashing together. 6 hours ago, I was alone. Now I'm supposed to believe I have everything I've ever wanted, with the daughter of a man I killed. and someone's already trying to murder us both. You see how this looks? I see how it looks, Amar said, standing up despite the visible effort it took. Despite the way her hand braced against her lower back, it looks like you're so used to betrayal, you can't recognize the truth when it's standing in front of you, carrying your daughter. She moved toward the window, staying to the side like Tony had taught her in the 30-second security briefing, and Vito noticed how naturally she fell into the behavior, how ingrained the survival instincts were. My father was a monster, she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. He beat my mother until she stopped fighting back, until she stopped being a person and became just this ghost who cooked his meals and looked the other way when he brought his mistresses home. I was 12 when I first saw him kill someone, one of his own guys, over a missing shipment. He did it at the dinner table, made me watch, said it was educational. Vito wanted to interrupt, to say something, but the words kept coming, kept pouring out of her like poison she'd been holding too long. I ran away when I was 15. Got as far as Chicago before his men dragged me back. He locked me in my room for 3 months, said I was too valuable to let wander, that I'd make a good bargaining chip when it came time to forge alliances, that some lieutenant or captain would pay well for Carmine Corleone's virgin daughter. The rage that swept through Vito was immediate and visceral. Rage at a dead man he couldn't kill again. Rage at a system he'd perpetuated. Rage at himself for being part of the same machinery that had destroyed this woman's childhood. When I turned 17, he started taking meetings with potential buyers. That's what he called them. Buyers. Like I was a car or a weapon, and I knew I had one chance. So I stole money from his safe, $5,000, and I ran again. This time I made it. Changed my name, worked cash jobs, stayed invisible. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I spent 6 years building a life that had nothing to do with violence or territory or blood. I was happy, free, and then I met you at the Belmont, and you were so sad, so lonely, and I thought... Her voice cracked. I thought maybe I could give you one night, where you didn't have to be dawn-born. Where you could just be a man who needed someone to listen. I remember, Vito said softly, the fragments of that night assembling into something clearer. Her patient silence while he'd rambled about legacy and loss. The way she'd touched his hand when he'd mentioned his sister. The gentleness in her eyes that had made him feel seen instead of feared. We talked for hours. You never told me your name, just listened. Because I didn't want anything from you, Amar said. No favors, no connections, no money. Just one night of being human with another human. And then it became more, and afterward I panicked, thinking you'd investigate me, discover who my father was, assume I'd orchestrated the whole thing. So I left before dawn, disappeared again. And when you found out you were pregnant, Vito asked, needing the whole story, needing to understand. I was terrified, Amar admitted, because I knew what it meant, that you'd either think I was lying, using the baby to get something from you, or you'd want to be involved, and I'd be pulled back into the world I'd spent 6 years escaping. But the longer I carried her, the more I felt her move, the more I realized she deserved better than my fear. She deserved to know her father. Before Vito could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, just a photo, and when he opened it, his blood turned to ice, because it showed Amara walking into the taco joint earlier tonight, time-stamped, taken from across the street, and below it a single sentence. She's been marked for 3 days. You're already compromised. Tony appeared in the doorway, his own phone out, his face grim. Boss, we got a problem. Just got word from Sal. There's chatter that the Corleone remnants have been planning something big, something involving Carmine's daughter. They think she's the key to legitimizing a claim against your territories. What claim? Vito demanded, standing. Carmine had a son, Tony said carefully. Nobody's seen him in years. He disappeared after you took out his father, went underground. But rumor is he's been building support, gathering the scattered families. And now suddenly his sister surfaces, pregnant, connecting with you. The implication landed like a hammer. They think the baby's leverage, Vito said, seeing the play now, seeing how Amara could be an unwitting pawn in a larger game. If her brother can claim she's reconciling the families through marriage or alliance, he can challenge my authority, unite the old Corleone loyalists. Or, Tony said quietly, glancing at Amara, she's part of it. The brother sends her to seduce you, get pregnant, create a blood tie that legitimizes his claim to your empire. No, Amara said fiercely, her hand protective over her belly. I haven't seen my brother in 8 years. I don't even know if he's alive. This isn't... I'm not... But doubt had crept into Vito's mind, the old paranoia reasserting itself, because this was how wars were won, with beautiful lies and long cons, with weapons wrapped in soft skin and gentle words. And he'd been so desperate for a child that maybe he'd missed the signs. Maybe he'd let hope blind him to the trap. I need proof, Vito said, hating himself, but unable to stop. DNA test tonight. And I need to know where you've been for the last 6 months. Who you've been in contact with. Everything. Amar's face crumpled, the hurt there so raw and genuine that Vito almost took it back, almost crossed the room to pull her into his arms. But Tony was watching, and his phone was buzzing with more messages, and somewhere out there, people were moving pieces on a board that ended with him dead or dethroned, and he couldn't afford to be wrong. Fine, Amara whispered. Test me, investigate me, do whatever you need to do. But Vito, when you find out I'm telling the truth, when you realize I'm not my father or my brother or whatever enemy you're imagining, I need you to ask yourself if you're capable of being the man I met that night at the Belmont. Because that's the man I want raising our daughter, not this. She gestured at him, at the gun still in his hand, at the walls he'd rebuilt in the last 5 minutes. Not the Don who sees threats in everything, but the man who cried when he talked about his sister, who wanted to build something that mattered. Tony cleared his throat. I'll make the calls. Get a tech here within the hour for the DNA sample. But boss, we should move her after. This location's compromised. Vito nodded, still watching Amara, watching the way she held herself together even as tears slid down her cheeks, and something in his chest twisted. Because whether she was lying or not, whether this was a con or a miracle, she was still pregnant, still vulnerable, still carrying what might be his last chance at the family he'd wanted his entire life. And if he destroyed this through suspicion and fear, he'd have no one to blame but himself. I want to believe you, he said quietly. The admission costing him, more than I've wanted anything. Then believe me, Amara said, and she crossed the room, took his scarred hand, and placed it gently on her swollen belly, holding it there. And after a moment, Vito felt it. A small, distinct flutter, a kick, a tiny life making itself known. And the shock of it, the reality of it, nearly drove him to his knees because this was real. This was his daughter. And in that moment, nothing else mattered, except keeping both of them alive long enough to learn the truth. The technician, a nervous kid named Danny who owed Vito 3 favors in his life, finished packing up the DNA testing equipment at 2 in the morning. his hands shaking slightly as he sealed the samples. Amara's blood and Vito's cheek swab, both labeled and logged. And he promised results in 6 hours, instead of the usual 48. Because when Don Bourne asked for a miracle, you figured out how to deliver, or you figured out how to disappear. Rush it, Vito said, slipping Danny an envelope thick with cash. And Danny, this stays between us. You tell anyone, your boss, your girlfriend, your priest, and they'll find pieces of you in 3 different states. Danny nodded so hard Vito thought his neck might snap, then fled into the night, leaving Vito alone with Amar and Tony, and the suffocating weight of waiting, of not knowing, of having his entire future hanging on test results that wouldn't come until dawn. Tony was making coffee in the tiny kitchen, his movements methodical, and Vito watched him the way he'd learned to watch everyone, looking for tells, for inconsistencies, for the small betrayals that preceded the large ones. But Tony had been with him since the beginning, had taken bullets meant for Vito, had kept secrets that could have bought him immunity and a new life. And if Vito couldn't trust Tony, then he couldn't trust anyone, which meant he was already dead, just waiting for the bullet to catch up. You should rest, Vito said to Amara, who was curled on the couch, exhaustion painted across her face in shades of gray and purple. I'll wake you when Danny calls. I can't sleep, Amar said quietly. Every time I close my eyes, I see that gun coming up, see the window exploding, see. Her voice caught. See what my life's going to be like now, what her life's going to be like. Running, hiding, always looking over our shoulders. Vito sat beside her, careful to maintain distance, uncertain if she wanted comfort from the man who'd just demanded proof of her honesty like she was a hostile witness. If the test confirms you're telling the truth, he said carefully, I'll protect you, both of you, whatever it takes. And if I'm lying, Amara asked, meeting his eyes. If somehow this baby isn't yours, even though I know it is, what then? The question hung between them, sharp and dangerous, and Vito realized he didn't have an answer, because somewhere in the last 6 hours, between the note and the shooting, and the small flutter of life against its palm, he'd stopped being able to imagine a world where this wasn't real, where she wasn't his, where the baby wasn't the answer to every prayer he'd abandoned. Hope of seeing answered, then I'll still protect you, Vito heard himself say, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Because you're right. I've spent so long seeing threats that I forgot how to see people. And whether that's my daughter or not, you're still a woman who's been terrorized and shot at, and dragged into a war that isn't yours. And I don't abandon people who need help. Amar's eyes filled with tears, the hard shell she'd been maintaining finally cracking. The man at the Belmont said something like that. When I told him I was alone in the city, running from a bad situation, he gave me $500 and the name of a women's shelter. Said nobody should have to run alone. Vito had forgotten that. Had forgotten the girl with the sad eyes and the careful way she'd avoided talking about her past. Had forgotten the protective surge that had made him reach for his wallet. But now it came rushing back, along with the memory of how she'd refused the money at first, too proud or too scared to take what looked like charity, until he'd convinced her it was a loan, that someday when she was safe, she could pay him back by helping someone else. You never cashed it, Vito said, the realization hitting him. The 500. I checked after, when I was trying to find you. The check never cleared. Because I couldn't risk you tracing it, Amara admitted. By then, I'd figured out who you were, what you'd done to my father, and I was terrified you'd think I'd orchestrated the whole night. So I burned it, started over with nothing. Before Vito could respond, Tony emerged from the kitchen, his face grim, holding his phone. "We've got a problem. Polly just called a meeting of the captains. Tomorrow morning. Says it's about a threat to the family structure. About how sentimentality is weakness. About how leaders who can't make hard choices need to be replaced." The threat was clear, the timeline accelerating, and Vito felt the trap closing around him because Polly had been patient, had been waiting for years for Vito to show vulnerability, and now he had it. A pregnant woman with the wrong last name, a claim to an heir that looked convenient enough to be suspicious, a Don who'd chosen protection over pragmatism. "He's going to call for a vote," Vito said, seeing the play. "Make it about my judgment. Use Amara as proof I'm compromised." "That's my read," Tony confirmed. "And boss, half the captains are young guys who don't remember the wars, who think you're old guard, who see Polly as the future. This vote could go either way." Vito's phone buzzed. A text from Danny, too early, 6 hours compressed into 40 minutes. And his hands were steady as he opened it, even though his heart was trying to break through his ribs because this was it. This was the moment everything either came together or fell apart. The message was short, 99.9% match. "She's telling the truth. Baby is yours. Congratulations, Dawnborn." The relief that crashed through Vito was so intense he had to sit down, had to press his palms against his eyes to stop the sudden burning there. And when he looked up, Amara was watching him with hope and fear tangled together, waiting for the verdict that would decide her fate. "It's mine," Vito said, his voice rough. "She's mine. You were telling the truth." Amara's sob was immediate and raw, her whole body shaking with the release of 6 months of fear and uncertainty. And Vito crossed to her without thinking, pulled her into his arms, held her while she cried into his chest, and he pressed his face into her hair and breathed her in and thought about how close he'd come to destroying this through suspicion, how close he'd come to being exactly the monster everyone believed him to be. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her temple. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry You were protecting yourself," Amara said, pulling back enough to look at him, her hands framing his face. "You were being smart. I get it, Vito. I hate it, but I get it. This world taught you that trust is suicide." "Then we're both survivors," Vito said, covering her hands with his, "both running from the same thing." And then he was kissing her. Or she was kissing him, or they were meeting in the middle, desperate and gentle and fierce all at once, tasting salt from her tears, and hope, and the promise of something neither of them had believed possible. And when they broke apart, Amara was smiling through the tears, her forehead pressed to his. "So what now?" she whispered. "Now I handle Polly," Vito said, the old steel returning to his voice. "Now I make it clear that you and our daughter are off limits, that anyone who threatens my family answers to me." "Vito," Tony said quietly from across the room, his voice strange, and when Vito turned, he found his driver standing with his gun drawn, pointed not at the door but at them, at Vito and Amara, and the betrayal hit harder than any bullet could have. "Tony!" Vito kept his voice level, his mind racing through options. Through 20 years of trust disintegrating in a single moment. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry, boss," Tony said, and he actually looked sorry, his eyes pained. "But Polly made me an offer. Said when you were gone, I'd be his number 2. Said this was business, nothing personal." 20 years, Vito said quietly, his hand moving slowly toward his own weapon. "I trusted you with my life." "And I kept you alive for 20 years, Tony countered. "But you're not the future, Vito. You're the past. And I've got a daughter, too. College tuition. A future to think about. Polly's offering me that future. The gun barrel didn't waver, but Tony's finger wasn't on the trigger yet, wasn't committed, and Vito calculated angles and distances and the likelihood that he could draw and fire before Tony did. Calculated whether he could shield Amara, whether he'd have to choose between his own life and hers. If you do this, Vito said carefully, Polly will kill you within a year. You know too much. You're a loose end. Maybe, Tony said, but maybe I'm smarter than you think. Maybe I've got insurance. Tony, Amara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. You said you have a daughter. How old? Tony blinked, surprised by the question. 16. Why? Because I was 16 when my father's men became my prison guards, Amara said quietly. When they stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an asset. Is that what you want for her? A world where women are currency and loyalty means nothing, and everybody's just waiting for their chance to put a bullet in someone's back. Something flickered across Tony's face. Doubt. Or maybe recognition. And his gun lowered slightly, and in that moment, Vito saw his opening and took it. Not for the gun, but for the truth. Help me change it, Vito said. Help me build something different. Where our daughters don't have to be afraid. And Tony stood there, gun shaking in his hand, caught between the old world and the possibility of a new one. Between Polly's promises and 20 years of brotherhood, and Vito held his breath and waited to see which choice would kill him. Tony's gun clattered to the floor, his hands coming up empty, and for a moment Vito thought they'd won, thought 20 years of loyalty had reasserted itself. But then the door exploded inward and 4 men in tactical gear flooded the room, weapons trained, and Vito recognized the lead operator, Marco Chen, one of Polly's most ruthless enforcers. The kind of man who slept well after burning down houses with families inside. And he understood that Tony hadn't been working alone, had been stalling, had been keeping them in place until the real threat arrived. Don't move, Marco said, his voice flat, professional, and Vito's hand froze halfway to his weapon because Amara was beside him and these men wouldn't hesitate to shoot through her to get to him. Wouldn't care about the baby or the DNA test, or the future Vito had been building in his head for the last hour. Polly sends his regards, Marco continued, stepping closer. Says to tell you that the family appreciates your service, but all empires end, and yours ends tonight. Vito calculated odds. 4 trained operators with automatic weapons versus his single pistol and a pregnant woman to protect, and came up with nothing. Came up with surrender or suicide. Came up with the darkest math he'd ever had to do. Let her go, Vito said quietly, his eyes locked on Marco. She's got nothing to do with this. She's just a girl who got caught up in something she doesn't understand. She's Carmine Corleone's daughter, carrying your bastard, Marco said, almost bored. She's everything to do with this. Polly wants her too. Says the baby might be useful leverage with her brother, might help smooth the transition when he takes over your territories. The confirmation that Amara's brother was real, was active, was part of this plot hit Vito like a physical blow, and he saw Amara's face go white, saw her hand press protectively over her belly. I told you, Amara whispered, her voice breaking. I told you I haven't seen him in 8 years. I don't know what he's planning. Doesn't matter what you know, Marco said, gesturing to one of his men. You're a Corleone. That makes you a bargaining chip. The operator moved toward Amara, and Vito stepped between them without thinking, his body a shield again, and he saw Marco's finger move to the trigger, saw his own death approaching at 700 feet per second. But before anyone could fire, Tony launched himself at Marco. 20 years of military training compressed into 3 seconds of violence that sent both men crashing into the wall, and Tony was screaming, "Run! Boss! Get her out, now!" Vito grabbed Amar's hand and ran, hauling her toward the back bedroom where Tony had shown him the fire escape during the security briefing. And behind them, he heard gunfire, heard Tony's grunt of pain, heard Marco shouting orders. But he couldn't stop, couldn't help, could only focus on the window and the rusted ladder beyond and getting Amar to safety because she was carrying his daughter. And if he failed at nothing else in his life, he couldn't fail at this. The fire escape groaned under their combined weight, bolts pulling loose from brick that had been crumbling since before Vito was born. And Amara was moving too slowly, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance, her breath coming in panicked gasps, and Vito was trying to help her and watch the window above them and calculate how many seconds they had before Marco's men followed. They were 2 floors from the ground when the shooting started again, bullets punching through the fire escape's metal grating, sparks flying, and Vito covered Amar's body with his own, felt something hot slice across his shoulder, felt blood soaking into his shirt. But the pain was distant, unimportant, drowned out by the animal need to protect her, to get her away from this. They hit the alley at a run, Vito's shoulder screaming, and he guided Amara toward the street, toward the crowds and lights where Marco would have to be more careful, where witnesses might matter. But when they rounded the corner, 3 black SUVs were waiting, engines running, and Vito recognized Polly sitting in the back of the middle vehicle, window down, smoking a cigar like he was watching a show. "Vito," Polly called out, almost cheerful, "we need to talk about your retirement package." Vito pushed Amar behind him, his gun finally in his hand, knowing it was useless against this much firepower, but unable to go down without the weight of it in his palm. "Let her go, Polly. This is between us, between family." "Family," Polly repeated, like the word was funny. "You know what's interesting about family, cousin? It's supposed to be forever. Supposed to be the one thing you can count on. But you were ready to throw it all away for some girl you barely know, for a baby you can't even be sure is yours." "I have proof," Vito said. "DNA test. She's mine." "DNA can be faked," Polly said, waving his cigar dismissively. "Doctors can be bought. You're smarter than this, Vito. You know she played you. You know this whole thing is her brother's operation, designed to make you weak, to make you choose her over the family. And congratulations, it worked." Behind Vito, Amar made a small wounded sound, and he wanted to turn to her, to tell her he didn't believe Polly's poison. But he couldn't take his eyes off his cousin, couldn't afford the second of inattention that would get them both killed. "Even if you're right," Vito said carefully, "even if she's lying, what's your play here? Kill me in the street. Start a war with the captains who are still loyal to me." "The captains are already handled," Polly said, and his smile was cruel, triumphant. "I've been talking to them for months. They know you're finished. They know childless leaders are bad luck, bad business. They're ready for new blood." And Vito understood then that he'd already lost, that while he'd been drowning in loneliness and desperation, Polly had been systematically dismantling his support, had been whispering doubts and promises, had been building the coup that would end with Vito dead and Polly sitting in his chair, ruling his empire. "But here's the thing," Polly continued, leaning forward. "I'm not unreasonable. You walk away tonight, leave the city, leave the business, leave the girl, and I'll let you live. You get to disappear, get to spend whatever years you have left in some beach town somewhere, drinking yourself to death in peace. That's the deal. And Amara, Vito asked, already knowing the answer. She stays, Polly said flatly. Her brother wants her back, wants the baby, wants to rebuild the Corleone name with your bloodline attached to it. That's his price for supporting my takeover. His sister and her kid, alive and unharmed. The trap was perfect, the choice impossible. Vito's life for Amar's freedom, or both of them dead in an alley while Polly took everything anyway. You have 30 seconds, Polly said, checking his watch. Then my men open fire and we clean up the mess. Vito felt Amara's hand on his back, felt her shaking, felt the baby between them, his daughter, the miracle he'd waited his whole life for, and he thought about his sister Elena, about the promise he'd made to build something that lasted, about how he'd spent 27 years constructing an empire that was about to crumble because he'd been too broken to see the betrayal coming. Vito, Amara whispered, her voice thick with tears. Just go. Save yourself. I'll be okay. But she wouldn't be. They both knew it. Knew that her brother would use her and the baby as puppets, would raise Vito's daughter in the same world of violence, and fear that had destroyed Amar's childhood would turn her into another bargaining chip in an endless war. I can't, Vito said, and he turned to face her, memorizing her face because these might be the last seconds they had. I can't leave you. I can't abandon her, even if it costs me everything. Then you're both dead, Polly said, and his hand came up in a signal, and Vito heard safeties clicking off, heard the moment before the storm, and he pulled Amar into his arms and closed his eyes and waited for the thunder that would end them both. And his last thought was that at least he'd die protecting something real, something that mattered more than power or territory or legacy. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the only victory left. The gunfire never came, replaced instead by sirens, by flashing lights, by a voice over a loudspeaker shouting, FBI, drop your weapons! And Vito's eyes snapped open to see federal vehicles blocking both ends of the alley, to see agents in tactical gear pouring out, to see Polly's face go from triumphant to shocked to calculating in the span of a heartbeat. And he didn't understand, didn't know where this miracle had come from. But Amara was crying against his chest, and they were still alive. And for the moment, that was enough. The lead FBI agent was a woman in her 40s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. And she walked straight toward Vito with her badge raised, her voice carrying across the chaos of Polly's men, dropping weapons and federal agents shouting commands. Dawn Bourne, I'm Special Agent Catherine Bowen. We need to talk. Vito kept Amara behind him, his mind racing through possibilities, through whether this was better or worse than Polly's bullets, through whether federal prison was just another kind of death. But Agent Bowen holstered her weapon and gestured toward an unmarked car away from the growing crowd of arrested mobsters. You're not under arrest, she said quietly. Not tonight, anyway. Someone made a very interesting phone call about 40 minutes ago. Someone who said a pregnant civilian was in immediate danger and provided extremely detailed information about an ongoing RICO conspiracy. Vito's eyes cut to the ambulance where paramedics were loading Tony on a stretcher, his chest bandaged, his face pale but alive. And their eyes met across the distance and Tony nodded once. A final act of loyalty that had saved them both, and Vito understood that his driver had made a choice in that apartment, had chosen 20 years of brotherhood over Polly's promises, had bought their survival with information that would dismantle the entire family structure. Tony's cooperating, Agent Bowen confirmed, giving us everything, names, dates, locations, the whole organizational chart. In exchange, we're putting him and his daughter in witness protection. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry it took so long to do the right thing. The relief and gratitude and grief all crashed together. And Vito had to look away because men like him didn't cry, didn't show weakness. Except Amara's hand found his, and squeezed gently, and he realized that maybe it was okay to be human, to acknowledge that loyalty still existed, that Tony had thrown away his future to save Vito's. "What do you want from me?" Vito asked Agent Bowen, because federal agents didn't show up with this much firepower just to be helpful. "I want Polly Bourne and the entire network," Bowen said bluntly. "I want warrants that stick, evidence that's admissible, witnesses who'll testify. Tony's giving us the financial trail, but we need someone who understands the power structure, who can explain how decisions get made, how orders flow down." "You want me to flip," Vito said, the words bitter, "become an informant." "I want you to think about your daughter," Bowen said, her eyes dropping to Amar's belly. "About what kind of world she's born into. You keep running this empire. She grows up with a target on her back, with bodyguards and paranoia, and eventually a funeral to attend when someone finally gets lucky. Or you help us clean this up, take the major players off the board. And maybe, she gets to be a normal kid." It was the same choice Vito had been circling for hours, for years, for his entire life. The empire or the family, power or peace, the throne or the chance to be human. But now it wasn't theoretical, wasn't abstract, because his daughter was real, was growing inside Amara, was going to be born into whatever world he built for her. "If I cooperate," Vito said carefully, "what happens to me?" "Witness protection, new identity, relocation," Bowen said. "You'd have to leave everything behind, the money, the properties, the name. You'd be nobody, just a guy with a family trying to live quietly somewhere far from here. Nobody." The word should have terrified him, should have felt like annihilation, but instead it sounded like freedom. Like the release of a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "And her?" Vito asked, nodding toward Amara. "She's already nobody," Bowen said gently. "Already been running, already changed her name, already knows how to disappear. The question is whether she wants to disappear with you." Vito turned to Amara, searching her face, and found her watching him with tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand still gripping his like a lifeline. "I need to tell you something," Amara said, her voice shaking, "about my brother, about why he's really doing this." "I know," Vito said. "He wants power, wants to rebuild. He wants revenge." Amara interrupted. "When you killed my father, you freed me. I was supposed to be married off the next week to some captain in the Moretti family. Some man twice my age who'd already buried 2 wives. My father's death gave me the chance to run, to escape, to actually live. But my brother, he loved our father, worshipped him, thought he was building something great. He blames you for destroying our family, and he spent 8 years planning how to destroy yours." She took a shuddering breath. "When I found out I was pregnant with your baby, I thought about reaching out to him, thought maybe we could reconcile. But then I realized he'd see her as a weapon, as a tool to hurt you. So I stayed hidden, stayed quiet, because I couldn't let him use our daughter the way our father used me." The honesty, the raw vulnerability, the courage it took to admit that her own brother was a threat, all of it broke something open in Vito's chest. All of it made him understand that she'd been fighting the same war he had been choosing between blood and humanity, had been trying to protect their child from the very beginning. "I'm done," Vito said, the words coming out clear and certain. He turned back to Agent Bowen. "I'll cooperate. I'll give you everything. But I need guarantees. Amar and the baby go into protection immediately. New identities ready before she gives birth. And security until we can relocate. Done, Bowen said. What else? Tony's daughter gets a full scholarship. Whatever school she wants. Whatever future she's dreaming of. He earned that. Bowen nodded. We can make that happen. Anything else? Vito thought about the empire he'd built, about the power and fear and blood, about all the years spent climbing towards something that now felt hollow and pointless, and he realized there was only one thing left that mattered. I want my cousin, Vito said quietly. Paulie. I want him to know that I'm the one who took it all away, that his greed and betrayal cost him everything. He'll know, Bowen promised. By morning, every wire, every recording, every financial transaction Tony documented will be logged as evidence. Paulie's looking at life without parole. It should have felt like victory, but instead it just felt like exhaustion, like the end of a marathon Vito had been running since he was 16 years old, since his sister died, and he'd promised to build something that lasted, not understanding that empires built on blood could never last, could only consume. Can we go? Amar asked quietly. Please, I just want to go somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. Agent Bowen gestured to a female agent standing nearby. She'll take you to a secure location. We'll need your full statement tomorrow, but for tonight, just rest, both of you. As they moved toward the waiting car, Vito pulled Amara close, his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, despite the blood on his shirt from the shoulder wound he'd forgotten about, despite everything that had happened, despite all the reasons she should run from him instead of toward him. I meant what I said earlier, Vito whispered against her hair. I can't leave you, won't leave you. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Together, Amar echoed, and she turned her face up to his, and he kissed her there in the flashing lights of federal vehicles and the ruins of his old life. Kissed her like she was the only real thing in a world of shadows and lies. Kissed her like she was his redemption and his future, and the answer to every question he'd been asking for 27 years. And for the first time since his sister died, Vito Bourne felt something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He felt hope. The safe house the FBI provided was sterile and cold, all white walls and government-issue furniture, but it had hot water and clean sheets, and most importantly, armed agents outside every entrance, which meant Amara could finally sleep without jumping at every sound. And Vito sat beside the bed watching her breathe, his shoulder bandaged and throbbing, but the pain distant compared to the surreal peace of knowing she was safe, that their daughter was safe, that for the first time in decades he wasn't calculating angles and threats and betrayals. Agent Bowen arrived at dawn with coffee and a tablet full of documents, her expression grim in a way that made Vito's instincts scream warning. We have a problem, she said quietly, gesturing for Vito to follow her to the kitchen where they wouldn't wake Amara. Paulie made bail 2 hours ago. Someone posted 5 million cash. Who? Vito demanded, already knowing the answer, already seeing the shape of the final play. A lawyer, representing the Corleone family interests, Bowen said. Specifically, a man claiming to be Carmine Corleone's son and rightful heir. He's calling himself Dante Corleone now, though our records show he was born Daniel Strode. He's filed legal paperwork claiming guardianship rights over his sister and her unborn child, citing family reunification and concern for her safety. The rage that swept through Vito was cold and calculating, the old Don reasserting himself because he understood exactly what Dante was doing, building a legal framework to claim Amara and the baby, to use the courts and public sympathy and the Corleone name to take what Paulie's bullets couldn't. And if he succeeded, if he got custody, Vito would lose everything that mattered while sitting helpless in witness protection. He can't do that, Vito said. She's an adult. She makes her own choices. Normally, yes, Bowen agreed. But he's arguing that she's been coerced, that you're a known criminal who's manipulated her, that the baby's paternity is questionable, and that, as her only living family, he has the right to intervene. He's got expensive lawyers and sympathetic judges and a PR team spinning this as a rescue mission. It's a takeover, Vito said flatly. He gets Amara and the baby. He legitimizes his claim to the old Corleone territories, uses my bloodline to unite the families Paulie's been courting, and builds an empire on my daughter's back. That's our assessment, Bowen confirmed. And there's more. We intercepted communications between Paulie and Dante. They're working together. Paulie gets reduced charges in exchange for testifying that you've been threatening Amara, that she's a victim who needs protection from you. It's a coordinated attack using the legal system as a weapon. Vito wanted to put his fist through the wall, wanted to find Paulie and Dante and solve this the old way. With bullets and fear and the absolute certainty that came from eliminating threats. But that world was gone. That version of himself was supposed to be dead, and he'd promised Amara he'd be different, be better, be the man worth raising their daughter. What can we do? He asked, hating how powerless the question sounded. Legally? Not much, Bowen admitted. You're a cooperating witness in protective custody, which means you can't exactly show up in family court. And Amara's connection to you makes her vulnerable to Dante's arguments that she's being controlled. Then we need to change the narrative, said a voice from the doorway, and Vito turned to find Amara standing there, her hand on her belly, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. We need to tell the truth. All of it. Amara, you should be resting. Vito started, but she cut him off with a look. I've been resting while men made decisions about my life for 24 years, she said firmly. My father, his soldiers, and now my brother thinks he can do the same. But this is my daughter, my choice, my life, and I'm done hiding. She turned to Agent Bowen. I want to make a statement. Public, on record, about everything. Who my father was, what he did to me, why I ran, why I kept the pregnancy secret from my brother, and why I choose Vito. That'll make you a target, Bowen warned. Every news outlet will pick it up. Every conspiracy theorist will have opinions, and Dante will absolutely use it against you. Let him try, Amara said, and Vito saw the steel in her that had kept her alive and free for 8 years. Saw the strength that had let her walk away from everything she knew to build something better. I'm not my father's daughter anymore, and I'm not my brother's pawn. I'm about to be someone's mother, and she deserves better than growing up in the shadow of lies. Within 3 hours, Agent Bowen had arranged a press conference, had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office, had set up a media room where Amara could tell her story to every camera and reporter who'd been circling the FBI's takedown of the Bourne family like sharks smelling blood. And Vito wanted to stop her, wanted to protect her from the exposure and judgment, but she'd asked him to trust her, to believe she could fight this battle her way. And so he stood in the back of the room and watched the woman carrying his child face down the world with nothing but the truth. My name is Amara Strode, she began, her voice steady despite the forest of microphones and cameras. I was born Amara Corleone, daughter of a crime boss, and for 17 years I lived in hell. My father was a monster who beat my mother, who treated women like property, who planned to sell me in marriage to strengthen his alliances. When he was killed, I didn't mourn. I ran, and I've been running ever since." The reporters were silent, captivated, and Amar continued, her hands folded over her belly. "6 months ago, I met a man who was kind to me when he didn't have to be, who listened when I needed someone to hear me, who gave me money for a shelter and asked nothing in return. I didn't know who he was. Didn't know he was the same man who'd killed my father. I just knew he was lonely and sad and trying to be better than his circumstances. We spent one night together, and then I disappeared because I was afraid. Afraid of my past, afraid of his world, afraid of everything except the life growing inside me." She paused, her hand moving in gentle circles on her stomach. "When I found out I was pregnant, I could have gotten an abortion. Could have given the baby up for adoption. Could have done 1,000 things that would have kept me hidden, kept me safe. But I wanted her. This little girl who kicks and moves and reminds me every day that I'm stronger than my fear. And I wanted her to know her father, because despite everything, despite his past, despite the violence he's been part of, he's also the man who cried when he talked about his dead sister, who wants to build something that lasts, who's been desperate for a family his entire life." Vito felt tears burning in his eyes, felt the truth of her words cutting through every defense he'd built. "My brother wants me to believe that I've been manipulated," Amar said, her voice hardening. "That I'm a victim who needs rescuing. But I've been a victim before, and this isn't what it looks like. This looks like choice. This looks like two broken people trying to build something better. This looks like love." The word echoed through the room, through Vito's chest, through every doubt and fear he'd been carrying. "So I'm making my choice public," Amara continued. "I choose Vito Bourne as my daughter's father. I choose witness protection and a new life over my brother's empire. I choose to break the cycle of violence and fear that's defined both our families. And if anyone, my brother, the courts, the media, thinks they can take that choice away from me, they're wrong, because I'm not afraid anymore." She stepped away from the microphones, and the room erupted in shouted questions. But Vito was already moving, already crossing to her, and when he reached her, he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. The words he'd never said to anyone, the admission he'd thought would make him weak, but instead it made him feel invincible. "I love you and our daughter and the life we're going to build." "I love you too," Amar said, pulling back to look at him. "Even though you're a criminal and a paranoid mess, and probably going to drive me crazy." "Probably," Vito agreed. And he kissed her there in front of all the cameras. Let the world see Don Vito Bourne choosing love over power, choosing family over empire, choosing to be human instead of feared. Later, in Agent Bowen's office, they watched the fallout. Dante's lawyers scrambling to respond. Paulie's bail revoked when new evidence surfaced linking him to the assassination attempt. The family captains turning on each other as the FBI's case expanded. The whole rotten structure collapsing exactly the way Vito had built it to, with betrayal and self-interest, and everyone looking out for themselves. "It's done," Bowen said, closing her laptop. "Dante's legal claim is dead in the water. No judge is going to override Amara's public statement. Paulie's looking at conspiracy to commit murder on top of the RICO charges. And your testimony is going to dismantle what's left of the organization. By this time next month, the Bourne family won't exist except in history books." Vito should have felt grief, should have mourned the empire he'd spent his life building, but instead, he just felt tired, ready to let it all go, ready to become whoever he was supposed to be next. "When do we leave?" he asked. 2 weeks, Bowen said. "We'll set you up in a small town, Montana or Wyoming, somewhere quiet. New names, new backgrounds, clean start. You'll have a modest house, enough money to live comfortably, and round-the-clock surveillance until we're sure there are no lingering threats." "And Tony?" Vito asked. "Him and his daughter are already relocated," Bowen confirmed. "He wanted me to tell you thank you. Said you taught him loyalty, even if it took him too long to remember it." Vito nodded, accepting the message, accepting that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. "One more thing," Agent Bowen said, sliding a folder across the desk. "You'll need to choose your new names. Thought you might want to do it together." Vito looked at Amara, saw her smile, saw their whole future waiting in a manila folder and a chance to be nobody, and he smiled back, ready for whatever came next. 3 months later, in a town called Silver Creek, nestled in the Montana mountains where nobody recognized their faces, and the biggest news was whose horse won the county fair, Vito, now called James Mitchell, stood in a nursery he'd painted himself. Soft yellow walls and white trim, assembling a crib with instructions that made less sense than most mob conspiracies he'd navigated. And through the window he could see actual mountains, actual sky, actual peace that didn't come with armed guards or exit strategies. "You're putting the side panel on backward," Amara said from the doorway, her belly enormous now, 9 months of pregnancy making her move like a ship in careful waters. And she was smiling that smile that still made his heart forget how to beat properly. "I'm engineering a new approach," Vito said, which was a lie. He was absolutely doing it wrong, but she laughed and came to help him, her hands guiding his to the correct position. And he marveled at how domestic this was, how normal, how the man who'd ordered executions over breakfast was now defeated by Swedish furniture instructions. "She's going to be here soon," Amara said softly, her hand moving to her belly, where their daughter was running out of room, running out of patience, ready to meet the world. 2 weeks, maybe less. Dr. Patterson said I'm already dilated. The fear that shot through Vito was different from any he'd known. Not fear of bullets or betrayal, but fear of failing this tiny person who hadn't even arrived yet. Fear of not knowing how to be a father. Fear of repeating his own father's mistakes, or Carmine's cruelty. But Amara's hand found his face, turned him to look at her. "You're going to be amazing," she said, like she could read his thoughts, like 3 months of living together in this small house had taught her his every worry. "You're already amazing. You gave up everything for her, for us. That's what good fathers do." "I didn't give up anything," Vito said truthfully. "I traded a kingdom I hated for a family I love. Best deal I ever made." They'd gotten married 6 weeks ago in the small church on Main Street, with Agent Bowen as a witness, and the local pastor who thought James Mitchell was a consultant recovering from a stressful career, and Amara was the best thing that ever happened to him, which wasn't technically a lie. The rings were simple silver bands that cost less than Vito used to spend on cigars, and there was no reception, no family, no traditions except the two of them promising to choose each other every day for the rest of their lives. And it was perfect, more real than any of the power or respect he'd commanded in his old life. "I heard from Catherine today," Amara said, using Agent Bowen's first name the way she'd started doing after the agent had driven 4 hours to attend their wedding. "Polly got life without parole, all 23 counts, and Dante took a plea deal, 15 years in exchange for testimony against the other families. It's over, Vito. Really over." The relief was profound and permanent, the final thread of the old world severed, leaving only this: a house that needed repairs, a town where he was just Jim, the guy who helped at the hardware store, a wife who knew every dark corner of his past and loved him anyway, and a daughter about to be born into a world without contracts or soldiers or blood. "What do you think she'll be like?" Vito asked, his hand joining Amar's on her belly. "Smart," Amar said immediately. "Stubborn, definitely, with both our genetics. Maybe she'll be a lawyer, argue for justice instead of running from it. Or a teacher, or an artist, anything she wants, anything that makes her happy. As long as she's safe," Vito added, "as long as she never has to be afraid." "She won't be," Amara promised, "because she'll have a father who knows what darkness looks like and will do anything to keep her in the light." That night, after the crib was finally assembled correctly, and dinner was eaten, and they'd walked down to the creek that gave the town its name, Vito lay in bed with Amara curled against him, her breathing evening out into sleep, and he thought about the empire he'd built and abandoned, about the men who'd feared him and the power he'd wielded, about his sister Elena and the promise he'd made to build something that lasted. And he realized he'd finally kept it. Not through violence or territory or forcing loyalty, but through this, through choosing love, through becoming the kind of man his daughter would be proud to call father. 2 weeks later, at 4 a.m. when Amara's water broke, and they rushed to the small county hospital where everyone knew them as Jim and Amara Mitchell, where no one cared about the Bourne family or the Corleone legacy or anything except helping bring a new life into the world. Vito held his daughter for the first time, 6 pounds, 7 ounces of perfect tiny human, with Amar's dark eyes and a grip strong enough to hold his finger and his entire heart. And he cried, really cried, for the first time since his sister died, except these were different tears, cleaner, full of joy instead of grief. "What should we name her?" Amara asked, exhausted and radiant in the hospital bed. They discussed options, but never settled on one, waiting to see who she was. "Elena," Vito said softly, honoring his sister, honoring the promise, honoring the family he'd lost and the one he'd found. "Elena Rose Mitchell." "Perfect," Amara whispered, and when Vito placed their daughter in her arms, when he sat beside them on the narrow hospital bed with his hand covering both of theirs, he understood that this was what empire really meant. Not territory or fear or power, but this small circle of love, this family he'd built with laughter and presence and showing up every single day. This legacy that would last, not because it was enforced, but because it was chosen. And somewhere in a Montana dawn, in a town that would never make headlines, Don Vito Bourne became just a father, just a husband, just a man who'd finally found his way home. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Hey, thank you so much for staying with me through this whole journey. If this story touched your heart, moved you, or made you believe in second chances and redemption, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these powerful stories of hope and transformation, because there are so many more coming, and I can't wait to share them with you.